I was asked if I could take a look at a tougher front-end problem. One of the problems they referenced was this one. I'm not really interested in solving this specific problem since, as you can see on the webpage, it's already been solved. I don't know if it's been solved well or not, but I've decided to take a look at the more generalized problem. So let's give a rundown of the problem itself. It's just you have a grid of a specific shape. If you click the buttons in a specific order or the cells in a specific order, then once all of them have been clicked, they should automatically deselect themselves in the same order as they have been clicked. Now, the generalized problem for me would be not a specific grid, but in any grid. Right. And for that, I'll have to admit I cheated a bit. I did play around with CSS to see how I'd create such a grid. I have to admit I don't do a lot of CSS. So I thought before we just watch myself read documentation on CSS properties for half an hour that I'll do that in advance. And what I came up with is essentially just a Flexbox grid container, which will just flex in direction of the columns with a fixed gap, and it'll be as small as the content. And in there we'll add rows, which are gonna be flex containers again with a fixed height. And inside there we'll have a fixed width cell. The box sizing here is just, if we don't do that, then the omitted cells will have a different size, so because the border will be added to the actual size. And box sizing, border box makes the size relative to the border. So it includes the border in the size. Right, and then just a class to make the cursor show up as a clickable one. I'm not sure on which one I put it. On the first one, yeah. So this is the CSS I'll be working with. And I've set up a project. Let me switch to the editor. I set up a project. It's just a create rect app. I set up ESLint and I using TypeScript. If you use a JetBrains family of editor, currently you have to fix ESLint to 8.2.2 since 8.2.3 changed their internal API and JetBrains was a bit naughty and they used the internal API, so it's broken. Until they update VED, you have to just downgrade ESLint. But I believe most web devs use VS Code anyway, so. Right, I've done nothing to this so far. Let's just delete content. Let's copy our CSS over. And there's nothing inside here. Let's actually copy it over to apps CSS. They're over there. Let's make sure that something's actually rendering. Just anything on the screen. It does. And yeah, let's think about how we want to do this. We want a method of specifying a grid. We need to animate the deselection somehow. And I suspect this is the part he meant by tough, because it's not necessarily trivial to do. A grid, and we need to capture click order. So, component-wise, we need a grid. Being able to render a grid of cells. And I just start with the rendering a grid. So let's create our component, and I'll just call it grid layout. Okay, now it does. Okay. And we want to grab the children, and then we'll just use our div, our class name, and in my case, I called it grid layout in the CSS here. So I just add this class and just pass the children in. And then start here with the grid layout. I'll be doing this mostly in the parent component, since this is not too complex. One could refactor it into separate components. Maybe we'll do that, but for now I just prototype in there. Then we have a grid row. It's also a props with children. And we'll have our children in here. It's just also a div, and this time it's called row. And we're gonna pass in the children. Then we have a grid row. And let's add a grid cell. This time it doesn't have children. For now, we'll just leave the props empty. And it's just going to be a div with a class name of, I think I called it cell. And let's give it the simple border class so that we can also see it. Doesn't like this, okay. And let's add a grid cell in. Let's just add 3 grid cells. If we look over here, we get our 3 cells. And hopefully if we pass in another row with just 2 cells, we get them underneath. Okay, that seems to work. Let's try to recreate the shape we saw in the video. I believe that's just this. And let's, this works fine, but how do we move them to the next one? So if we want to have this in the middle, for example, I think we should just create an empty cell for that. Empty cell. And it just doesn't carry a border, for example. So then we can do an empty cell here. And it'll be in the middle. Right, so our first job, just render a grid of cells, is kind of done with that. We'd like to render it from a specification. So, why does it want to tab in? I don't know. From a specification, so dynamically instead. And I'll just define it with a 2D matrix of Boolean values. Let's recreate the shape. That should be the same shape. And we want to render this instead. And I'm not going to worry about any other thing. It's first just let's make it look right, and then we'll think about how to make it behave right. So we want to map instead over our grid. Which will be which contains a row and our y value. And we'll render a grid row for it. And this grid row will contain our grid cells. So cell and X. I'm including the coordinates already, since I already know I need the keys for this. So I can use here just the row index. Using indexes as keys generally not that great, because it uses them to determine if it should re-render something. And it might be an issue if the order of your elements changes, then the index might be misleading here. And this needs a key. Well, let's give it also its index as a key. And this won't work because it'll show it for all. But we can now just do we can just now check if cell is true or not. So if cell, then we return the grid cell, otherwise we return the empty cell. And we have it now rendered directly from the specification. And I like to split my ternary operators across a few lines. That's then easier to read as an if-else statement, basically. And it's just how I like to organize my code. Right, so we can mark these two off as kind of done. We have a method of specifying a grid. This should be ideally just a parameter. Maybe we'll, yeah, let's do that. So let's, what do we want to call this component? Reversible button grid, maybe? I don't know. And let's give it a props. It'll accept a grid, which has the shape of Boolean, 2D array of Boolean. And we'll just take all of our code, return this here instead. Reverse. Oh, I think this is right. And in here we're just going to have our reversible button grid feed in our grid. And this should work. I'm not sure why it's complaining that, oh, because I can't type. That's why. Okay. Okay. So that means now if we wanted to render multiple grids, we could do that. Yeah, that does work. If we wanted to render multiple grids, we could do that now simply. Let's leave it at 1 for now. And let's just move this down here. So the next problem would be, we also want them to be clickable actually. I just noticed that the cursor is not on it. Now we do actually have the cursor, but nothing happens when we click it. So we very much like to have some functionality on our clickable buttons. I just shorten this a bit. So pretty sure we're going to need some type of properties, so we can also define them. Grid props. There we go. For one, we want to know to detect a click. So on click, which is a just any function, really. And we'll take the onClick in here. And let's just pass the onClick along. And we can provide the onClick here, which for now, let's just do a console log statement of the coordinates that we clicked on. So if we click on any field now, we'll get the coordinates that we clicked on. Next, we want to mark them somehow that they have been clicked. So let's close that one. Let's add another class, which just background, and let's take something like light green. And was clicked, for example, which could be just a boolean. And then if we were clicked, was clicked, maybe let's call it is clicked or is marked. Let's call it marked. If it's marked, then we'll add the marked clicked label. Otherwise, we'll stay on. We're just not gonna add anything. That doesn't help us for now, but we can check if this works. By just marking the cell. They're all marked now. This seems to be fine. Another thing we want to prevent is that when the cell is marked, which I just saw, is that if we click the cell shouldn't be clickable anymore. Essentially. But we'll solve it later. For now, let's move the clickable into here. So if it's marked, we don't have a cursor. The click event still happens. But at least visually, there's no cursor. The cursor's back. Okay. Let's do that for now. We'll revisit this, certainly. Right, so next thing, just to get to the functionality, we'll care about the optics later. We want the click order to capture it somehow. We'll need some sort of state. In this case, I just opt for tracking a list of IDs, essentially. Click order. And since we'll want to play it back, I'll treat it as a queue. So the first button element we'll click will be at the beginning and the last element at the end. And then when we play back our click order, essentially just process the list from front to end, and we'll have the entire animation sequence. So the question is, what type should this be? I'd like to just be able to use an includes or something, so I don't want to have any composites like a pair of numbers. A single number is kind of... It's possible because we can translate the grid coordinates to numbers. Like this could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But I think I'll just use strings, and then we can use like a string xy, for example, as the ID. Yeah, this should be a string array. And then we can do here on a click, we can just add them to the click order for now. So set click order, click order. We'll keep the previous click order and add our current one. Okay. Right. We won't see anything happening for now, but if we look at, for example, our components and at our button, we'll see that our state has the click buttons. We'll have double entries in here, because if I click this multiple times, it'll show up multiple times. But we can see that we've added them to the state. And the next step would be to detect if we have been already clicked or not, and we can do that by just looking up in this click order, are we selected or not? So let's add a function as marked, which takes in two coordinates. And it'll just look up in the click order if that string already exists, our label. And then we can set marked to is marked xy. And if I reload the page and we click through here, we can see that it does track this correctly. We can see we've used this label twice now, and I'm certain we're gonna use it more times. So let's just refactor this out into a function. Let's call it cell label. We want to suppress adding it if it's already added. So let's add another function, const mark cell, which also takes x and y number. And it'll check basically if we're already marked. So set click order. Okay, so what I'm thinking about right now is this uses the current state, but I want the set click order to use the previous, just in case we have some order issues. So I think I'm actually going to add the array here as a parameter. And then we can do previous and then just check is marked x, y, previous. If it's already marked, we just return previous, we don't do anything. And if it's not already marked, then we'll add our label, cell label, for x and y. And down here, we'll just call the mark cell function of x, y. And this requires the click order as a parameter now. Everything should still work. It does. Next, we'll need to detect when every cell has been marked. Actually, this can be moved out here, as it doesn't use any internal stuff. This does. So, all cells marked. We can check by comparing the length of our click order with the number of cells we actually display. This is a two-dimensional grid, so it's not that trivial. But if we just sum over every row, and from the row we take the length. No, we need to filter it first for and then the length. So the reason we need to filter it first is because we have Boolean falses in here. And we don't want to count them. We want to have 7 cells in, we only want to count to 7, not to 9. Why is this marked? Because I never added a initial value. Let's start with 0. Let's log this out to convince ourselves that this is computed correctly. And actually, let's check for larger equals, just in case something happens and we overmarked somehow. Okay, I'm gonna take a look at this in a second. We see it's printing out true falsely. Because I need to add this to the sum. False, 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 true. Now, ideally, if we do test-driven development, we could just test this externally, have a helper function that accepts the click order and the grid and then checks if all of them are clicked. But for the sake of the exercise, I'm just going to leave it like this, which is also fine. So now that we know that, let's take care of this error, which wants the empty cell to have a key. And this is also just the x coordinate. Okay, we got rid of our error. And let's think about how to animate this. So we probably want to use a timeout of some sort. Effect. And if all cells are marked, then we want to start our animation somehow. So let's add our... So how do we start our animation? I just add a state to know that we are currently animating. I call it playback. Set playback. Let's call it playing back. Yeah, let's just call it also set, which will be a Boolean, and we start in the false state, and then we can down here just set playing back to true. Now, when do we stop animating? And that is when click order is empty. So if click order length 0, then we set our playback to false, and we need to add our click order to our dependencies here. So if we reload this, look at our component state, we expect playback to be false. This is the second state, and to be true once we hit all of them, which is the case. Can we modify state? Yeah, we can. And it should be false once we cleared them all, which it is. And let's take care of our actual animation. It'll certainly require playing back as an input. And if we don't need an if. Do we need an if? No, we need an if. We need to check if we're playing back, because we could be in the false case as well. So if we're playing back, then we start a timer. This timer does something. We'll think about it in a second. And let's just say it takes a second for it to do something. What does it do? It removes the first one from the click order. So let's remove the first one. If we click our way through here, then the first one got removed. It's not quite what we want. Why did it stop animating? We're in the do playback. Oh, because we need to run through this use effect every time. So the set order, the click order is also relevant. And we can see it's now actually animating. And our state flipped back to false. So if we select them in this order, it seems to work. This should be a parameter. And we want to clear the timer on an unmount. So let's do that. Let's return timeout. Timeout. We're going to clear the timeout now on a unmount. What else do we need? We want to prevent clicking, because right now if we select them all, we can keep selecting and the animation will keep playing. But technically, we want to stop the animation at this point. We want to disable that we can click. So let's check if we're playing back. If we're playing back, then we don't want to do anything on the click, and let's make our click a optional. We come back to our animation, we can now no longer select while the animation is playing. I was clicking rapidly with cell. Now, it would be nice if the cursor would reset as well, because currently we're telling the user that he can click, but he can't. So let's remove this. Marked will only mark it as clicked now, and we want to rather check if we are provided a click function, for example. So on click, and if on click is provided, then we are clickable, else we're not. Which also means we only want to have this markable we only want to provide the function if we're neither in playback nor we're marked. So if we click, we're not marked anymore. We're not clickable anymore. And we're still not clickable during the animation. Marked. Marked clickable, right. Right. This should be all of it. I mean, we can have it in here twice, just to convince ourselves that this is actually possible. And let's just take a square grid here. And if we render them together, we'll have them together and they're not fighting with each other. Right. And that's the entire problem solved. Let me just move it into here. Do we need to fix anything? I don't think so. I mean, we can delete a whole bunch of files we don't care about. But not really necessary. So if you've got any questions about this, feel free to leave a comment. I need to find my stop record button. There it is. Goodbye.